Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Christina Perri, titled Head or Heart. Look, I got a complicated relationship with Christina Perri. Now, I can make the argument that I've got a complicated relationship with the entire genre of piano-based adult alternative pop rock. As in, I tend to be more forgiving of it than the male counterparts on acoustic guitars. Look, I can't in good faith say that everything in this genre is good or works consistently, not by a long shot, but when you have artists that manage to come up with some imagination or unique framing or emotionally compelling performances, I'm normally pretty supportive. It normally works pretty well for me. Unless acts like Adele, A Fine Frenzy, Fiona Apple, Tori Amos, and to a lesser extent Vanessa Carlton and Regina Spektor, they do manage to work for me more often than they don't. And you know what? On first listen, Christina Perri was on that list too, and I distinctly remember liking Jar of Hearts a lot more than I didn't back in 2011. I think it even made my top 10 list. But then I listened to that debut album and my liking for her just nosedived in record time. Believe it or not, Christina Perri's greatest strength on those better songs was her emotional vulnerability, but it wasn't long before I noticed that her lyrics frequently approached hyperbole and sophomoric whining, which just got intolerable. And given that she wasn't exactly an impressive instrumentalist, it consigned large chunks of her material to being less compelling and more just tedious. And really, it made all too much sense for 1,000 Years to be attached to the Twilight franchise because it was a song so shallow and bereft of maturity when it comes to relationships and love that it made perfect sense to be attached to Stephenie Meyer's masturbation fantasy. So I put Christina Perri out of my mind completely, resolving that, you know what, I would come back when she put out another album and hoping that she might have, grown up in the meantime. So when Head or Heart came out a few days ago, I gave it a couple of listens. How did it go? Ugh. I should really like this album more than I do, because you know what? Head or Heart by Christina Perri, it's an improvement over her debut, and there are a lot of elements that I would normally react to in a better way. But it's also a record that fails when it's going for more ambitious material and nuance, which as a critic is the exact opposite of what you want to see. As such, you get a record that's actually pretty good when it sticks with objectively simpler or easier material, but it really starts to stumble when it guns for something heavier, which might have a lot worse implications. So okay, what goes right on this album? Well, for the most part, the instrumentation, it's pretty good. Sure, Christina Perri, she isn't a great pianist. She relies heavily on power chords and repetition, and her supporting arsenal of bleak electronic effects to create atmosphere. But you know what? At least there were more songs in this album that had a pulse and appear to be taking instrumental risks or having a little bit more diversity. One Night, for instance, it was a pretty solid shot at a Quiet Storm ballad, and Human was one of the better songs to use silence as an emotional climax that I've seen in a long time. And better yet, you get songs like Sea of Lovers or Burning Gold. They do a pretty good job of expanding their dramatic swell with strings and the occasional bit of folk-inspired sound. Nothing with a lot of texture or grit, mind you. This is production for Christina Perri, after all, where all the edges have been sanded off and most of the electronic elements are watery and they muddy the sound more than they should, which I have to admit really hamstrings the Spanish guitar on Lonely Child and the muted organ tones on the back of Run, which was a disappointment for me. But you know what? If I'm being honest, the melodies, they're not bad on this album, and they show how Christina Perri has grown more confident and more experimental as a songwriter. And you know what? That confidence really does show up in Christina Perri's delivery and in her songwriting. While I don't think I'll ever be the biggest fan of hers as a vocalist, she's got a lot of volume, but not a huge emotional range, at least right here on this album. But she does push herself harder on this record in terms of her vocal range. Plus, her songwriting has gotten better. And while there are still a few songs that are painfully high school on this album and that just won't do anything for me, I can imagine they'll absolutely kill with Christina Perri's target audience. And there are a few songs on this album where her musical theater background really does shine through in the bigger, more theatrical emotions. And I'll admit, I really like that. That worked for me. But it's where the song aims for more mature songwriting that we get some questionable material. And to be fair, there are moments where Christina Perri nails the emotional balance required in this sort of delivery. Human, for instance, it's a painfully vulnerable song about that she has limits in terms of how much she'll compromise or give up in terms of a relationship. And One Night goes for the hot passion of a one-night stand, and you know what? She kind of nails it. And as I mentioned before, songs like Burning Gold and Sea of Lovers, they work pretty damn well for the exuberant and very earnest songs that they are. But then you have songs like I Don't Wanna Break, where she seems to be aware that the relationship is collapsing and the guy's a liar, not very good, and she's still desperate to hold it all together. But if it doesn't work, she just wants to be close to this guy in question so that he can comfort her when it all falls apart. I hate to be blunt, Christina Perri, that's not often how it works. It's a weird tonal mishmash, and that's before you get to the chorus, which seems to be going for this soaring exuberance, and it's a really awkward fit. And the song is evidence of a bigger problem, analogous to that of Tokyo Police Club, in that I have no idea how self-aware Christina Perri actually is. Her songwriting seems to have a little bit more nuance, but her vocal delivery and the underlying messages that she's trying to put forward in her other songs, it's just so earnest that I'm not really sure that self-awareness even exists. And while it makes her songs honest in the framing and the songwriting, in capturing that stream of complicated emotions that often comes in troubled relationships, the tone of the instrumentation and her vocals, they don't really capture that level of nuance. Take, for instance, Lonely Child. If you're looking to make a song about how you need to come down from the heady rush of new love, maybe it's a poor idea to make the alternative look so depressing, or pair that sort of song with Spanish guitar. I mean, really? Or take Run, which is really Christina Perri's version of I Knew You Were Trouble by Taylor Swift. And while it is better than that song, marginally, it has the same logical problems that if you clearly know that this relationship is bad news and all your friends are telling you to run away from it, maybe you shouldn't stick around. And pairing it with a noir atmosphere to romanticize the whole relationship doesn't help matters at all. And look, while there are problems with the songwriting itself, I honestly think the biggest problem comes down to Christina Perri's vocal delivery. She's a very earnest and expressive performer who honestly would be great on stage, but she doesn't have a lot of subtlety outside of playing that very vulnerable set of emotions. And songs like these demand a more complex emotional range, like some that she's written, and they don't really stick the landing when she tries here. Even on the better ones that I've liked, I don't really say they rise to being great songs. She just doesn't have that degree of expressive emotional range. On top of that, there are tonal problems with most of these songs that really confuse their intentions, and not in a good way. Now, take for instance, in contrast, I've been re-listening through the earlier segments of Lacuna Coil's discography in preparation for covering their newest album. And you know what? I think the reason that the band managed to stick with me, despite making some sour, bitter, generally miserable music, is because the band can keep a consistent tone and has the emotional range to lend greater complexity to these songs. Whereas Christina Perri's very straightforward, very almost naive approach, it works on the simpler material, but really is very inadequate when she tries to go deeper just beyond vulnerability. And look, as I said, I want to like this album more than I do. Christina Perri does show more promise on this album than she did on her previous works, but learning a more expressive or complex emotional range when singing, that's an extremely difficult skill to master. Hell, it's one of the main reasons that certain songs are in my wheelhouse vocally, but I won't perform them as a singer. I get this problem. Unfortunately, it's still a problem that shows up on this album, and it's a factor from keeping Christina Perri out of my list of favorites. As for the album as a whole, as much as the thematic through line is about balancing the needs of head and heart, Christina Perri's delivery can't hold that balance whatsoever, and it tips into the heart category. For better, but more often for worse. With that in mind though, and the acknowledgement that the target audience will love this album, and it does land more hits than misses, it's a 6 out of 10 and a very tentative recommendation. But frankly, when we have acts like Adele, Tori Amos, A Fine Frenzy, Regina Spektor, Fiona Apple, and plenty others, I still think Christina Perri has a lot of work to do if she wants to truly measure up. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming up that you'd like me to cover, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, and I'll see you next time.